Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing stories ever recorded in the history of Savannah, Georgia. Before we get started, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this. We genuinely want to know which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. It was the year 1843 when the first rumors started going around about the Whitfield estate. Sitting about 3 miles outside of Savannah's busy center, the property was basically a showcase of old Southern wealth. A 2-story white colonial mansion with 6 big tall columns and a wraparound porch that looked out over rows and rows of cotton fields. For decades, the Whitfield name had meant one thing: money, status, and total respectability. Thomas Whitfield had been one of the richest plantation owners in Chatham County, with his family's roots going all the way back to Georgia's colonial days. But it wasn't the man's enormous fortune that would eventually get people whispering through Savannah's cobblestone streets. It was what happened after he died, when his widow Eleanena made a decision that would rock the whole foundation of antebellum society. The story first came to light when a clerk at the Chatham County Courthouse noticed something off in the estate documents filed after Thomas Whitfield died. According to records later recovered from the Georgia Historical Society archives in 1962, the clerk, whose name was written down as William Johnson, made a note in his private journal about a very strange arrangement involving the Whitfield estate. He wrote that he feared Mrs. Whitfield had lost her mind, or perhaps had been taken advantage of while she was grieving. What followed was a series of events that is still hard to fully wrap your head around even today. It's a story of forbidden connections, social taboos, and how far powerful people will go to protect their reputation, even if it means erasing people from history entirely. The Whitfield estate stood for nearly 120 years before it was destroyed in a fire in 1957. By that point, the story of Eleanena Whitfield and her unusual heir had faded from public memory, buried in sealed court documents and private letters locked away in family archives. But some stories just refused to stay buried. In the summer of 1968, during renovations of the old Chatham County Courthouse, workers found a hidden compartment behind a wall panel in what had once been the judge's private chambers. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, filled with handwritten accounts of the Whitfield case, accounts that had never been entered into the official record. What follows is the story pieced together from those recovered documents, newspaper clippings, personal letters, and the few surviving testimonies of people who actually witnessed the events. It's a story of how widow Eleanena Whitfield broke every rule of her time in ways that led people to whisper about madness, manipulation, and murder, and how, in the shadows of one of America's most hauntingly beautiful cities, a legacy was born that some people would sacrifice everything to keep hidden. People in Savannah still say that on certain nights, when the Spanish moss sways in the breeze off the Savannah River and fog rises up from the ground like ghostly fingers, you can hear the sound of footsteps on the land where the Whitfield plantation once stood, footsteps that seem to pace back and forth endlessly, searching for something that was promised but never delivered. Thomas Whitfield was 49 years old when he died on April 23, 1843. The official cause of death was written down as apoplexy, what we would now call a stroke. At the time of his death, Thomas had been one of the most well-known and respected people in Chatham County, a man whose opinion carried real weight in both business and political circles. Over 300 people showed up at his funeral, including the mayor of Savannah and 2 state representatives. The procession from St. John's Episcopal Church to Bonaventure Cemetery stretched for almost half a mile. Thomas was laid to rest in the Whitfield family mausoleum, an impressive Georgia marble structure that still stands today, though the name on it has been worn nearly smooth by time and weather. Eleanena Whitfield was just 26 years old when she became a widow. According to census records, she had been married to Thomas for 7 years but had no children. That fact alone would have put her in a tricky spot in 19th century Georgia society. A young childless widow with a lot of property was going to draw attention, and not all of it the good kind. But it was what Eleanena did in the weeks after her husband's death that truly set Savannah society on fire with scandal. According to the newly discovered documents, just 2 weeks after Thomas was laid to rest, Eleanena called her husband's lawyer, James Crawford, to the Whitfield estate. Crawford later wrote in his private letters that he found the young widow calm and clear-headed, even if she seemed a little different than usual. He had expected to talk through the standard estate and inheritance stuff, but instead he found himself faced with a very unusual request. Eleanena Whitfield wanted to free one of her husband's enslaved people, a man listed only as Samuel, and on top of that, she wanted to name him as a beneficiary in her husband's estate. In 1843, Georgia doing something like that wasn't just scandalous, it was practically a revolutionary act. Georgia had some of the strictest laws in the entire South when it came to freeing enslaved people. Since 1818, Georgia law required that any freed enslaved person leave the state within 30 days or risk being re-enslaved. On top of that, Georgia lawmakers had passed specific laws that made it illegal to leave property to an enslaved person in a will. What Eleanena was proposing wasn't just socially unacceptable, by the standards of the time, it was legally impossible. Crawford's letters make it clear he was immediately worried about Eleanena's reputation. He wrote to his brother in Charleston saying he had warned Mrs. Whitfield in the strongest possible terms against doing this. He reminded her of her position in society and the damage it would cause. But she didn't budge. She insisted it had been her husband's wish, even though no such thing appeared in the actual will that Crawford himself had drawn up the year before. This gap between what Eleanena claimed and what the will actually said became the first of many troubling questions about the whole case. If Thomas had truly wanted to do something for Samuel, why wasn't it in the legal will? And if this was all Eleanena's idea, what could possibly make a young Southern widow risk her reputation, her inheritance, and possibly even her own freedom for one of her husband's enslaved people? The answer, as it often does in these kinds of stories, seems to lie in the complicated and often contradictory relationships that existed inside that household. According to the household inventories in the estate papers, Samuel had been purchased by Thomas Whitfield in 1835, the very same year Thomas married Eleanena. Unlike most of the field workers on the cotton plantation, Samuel was listed as a house servant and was valued at the considerable sum of $1,200, nearly twice the usual price for an enslaved man at that time. That high price tag suggests he had special skills or education, although what exactly those were isn't spelled out in the surviving records. What the documents do make clear is that Samuel had an unusual position within the Whitfield household. While most enslaved people lived in separate quarters away from the main house, estate floor plans show that Samuel was given a room in the carriage house, which was connected to the main house by a covered walkway. Being that close to the family's living quarters was uncommon and suggests a level of trust that was pretty rare. On top of that, household account books show that while other enslaved people on the property got standard rations of food and clothing, Samuel received extra things, tailored clothes, books, and on at least 3 occasions, medical care from the same doctor who treated the Whitfield family, rather than the plantation's regular doctor. These details, while they might seem small, paint a picture of an enslaved person who held a very unusual position of privilege within that household. But they still don't explain why Eleanena Whitfield would risk everything to name him as a beneficiary after her husband died. For that explanation, we need to look at the most disturbing document found in the hidden courthouse compartment, a personal journal believed to belong to Rebecca Turner, Eleanena's personal maid, and one of the very few people with close access to the Whitfield household's private business. The journal covers the period from 1841 to 1844 and contains observations about everyday life in the Whitfield home, including some vague and unsettling references to tension between Thomas and Eleanena. According to Turner's writings, the marriage had been getting more and more strained in the years before Thomas's death. She describes Thomas as cold and frequently away, noting that he often traveled to Savannah for business and social events, leaving Eleanena alone at the plantation for weeks at a time. During those stretches, Turner writes that Eleanena would often seek out Samuel's company for reading and conversation, finding in him an educated mind that was so lacking in her own husband. That mention of Samuel's education is really significant because being able to read was uncommon among enslaved people and was often actively discouraged or flat-out illegal in antebellum Georgia. The journal suggests that Samuel had somehow picked up not just basic reading skills, but a real, substantial education, which made him a genuine intellectual companion for the clearly well-educated Eleanena. Turner notes that Eleanena would sometimes spend whole afternoons in the estate's library with Samuel, doors closed, as they talked about literature and philosophy. That kind of thing would have raised eyebrows even if it had been with a white man who wasn't her husband, let alone with an enslaved person. Turner's journal gets more and more worried as 1842 goes on. She writes about overhearing a fight between Thomas and Eleanena in December of that year, during which Thomas supposedly threatened to sell the fellow downriver, a common threat that meant being sold off to the brutal plantation conditions of the Deep South. Eleanena's response, as Turner recorded it, was way more heated than usual. She said she would sooner see the whole house burned to ashes. These entries are hard to ignore, but they're also frustratingly unclear. Was the relationship between Eleanena and Samuel really just two people who liked to read together, a lonely woman looking for someone to talk to among the very few educated people available to her? Or was there something more, something that would explain why, after Thomas died, Eleanena would risk absolutely everything to secure Samuel's freedom and financial security? The answer might be hiding in another document found alongside Turner's journal, a letter written by Dr. Richard Harris, the Whitfield family doctor, dated October 12, 1842. The letter was addressed to a medical colleague in Charleston and described a professional dilemma. He wrote that he had recently examined Mrs. W. because she had been complaining of persistent tiredness and low mood. In the course of that examination, he discovered evidence suggesting she was pregnant, about 4 months along. He wrote that this put him in a very delicate situation because her husband had been away on business in Augusta for the past 5 months and had only come back for a single weekend in July. If Dr. Harris's assessment was correct, and if his timeline holds up, the implications are both obvious and shocking. Thomas Whitfield could not have been the father of Eleanena's baby, and if the baby wasn't Thomas's, the number of people it could possibly have belonged to in that isolated plantation setting was very limited indeed. The doctor's letter goes on to say he had not yet told Mrs. W. about his findings, nor had he told anyone else. He wrote that he found himself in an impossible position, caught between professional confidentiality and moral obligation, and that the consequences if this came out would be severe for everyone involved. Dr. Harris's moral dilemma was apparently solved by events. Turner's journal records that in November 1842, Eleanena had a miscarriage while Thomas was away on business again. The only people there were Turner herself and Samuel, who was sent to get the doctor only after the worst had already passed. According to Turner, Thomas was never told about the pregnancy or its loss. This hidden tragedy adds yet another heavy layer to the already complicated relationship between Eleanena and Samuel, and potentially explains why, after Thomas's death, she was so determined to secure Samuel's future. If he really was the father of her lost child, her actions take on a whole new and deeply human meaning, not just a shocking act of defiance against social rules, but an act of love and loyalty that crossed the brutally rigid lines of her time. But the story only gets darker from here. Crawford's letters reveal that when he refused to help Eleanena with her plan to free Samuel and make him a beneficiary, she fired him as her lawyer. 2 weeks later, she hired Martin Hayes, a lawyer who had just arrived from Boston and had a reputation for sympathizing with abolitionists. Hayes agreed to draw up the papers, putting together a complicated legal arrangement that would technically follow the letter of Georgia's law while still getting Eleanena what she wanted. The plan, as laid out in Hayes's notes, was bold. Eleanena would sell Samuel to Hayes for just $5. Hayes would then take Samuel to Philadelphia, where he would free him under Pennsylvania law. Once legally free, Samuel would return to Georgia, not as a freed enslaved person, which would have been illegal, but as a free black man from the North, a status that, while still severely restricted, was at least legally recognized. Meanwhile, Eleanena would set up a trust fund in Philadelphia, funded by parts of the Whitfield estate, to take care of Samuel's financial future. It was a plan that poked through loopholes in Georgia's legal system, and it might actually have worked if it hadn't been for the interference of Thomas Whitfield's brother, Charles. According to court records filed in May 1843, Charles Whitfield challenged both Thomas's will and Eleanena's right to do anything with the estate's assets, claiming she was of unsound mind and had been manipulated by people who were hostile to the family's interests. He specifically asked the court to stop the sale of Samuel and to block any transfer of money out of Georgia until things could be sorted out. The judge, William Parker, issued a temporary injunction just as Charles requested. Eleanena was forbidden from selling any assets, including enslaved people, or transferring money out of Georgia. On top of that, the court appointed a guardian to assess Eleanena's mental state and figure out whether she was actually capable of managing the substantial Whitfield estate. That guardian, Dr. George Thompson, visited the Whitfield plantation 3 separate times in June 1843. His report, which survives in the court records, paints a disturbing picture of Eleanena's situation. He wrote that he found Mrs. Whitfield to be clear-headed and articulate, showing no signs of being crazy or mentally weak. He said she spoke clearly about business matters and showed good knowledge of her late husband's affairs. However, Thompson also noted with concern that Eleanena seemed unusually attached to her household servants, especially Samuel, whom she insisted on having present during all 3 visits, even when Thompson specifically asked to speak with her privately. Thompson's final conclusion was carefully worded. He said he couldn't in good conscience declare Mrs. Whitfield mentally incompetent, but he did express serious concern about her judgment in certain areas, particularly her stated plan to free and provide for certain enslaved people. He said those intentions showed a worrying disregard for what was socially acceptable and might suggest a moral confusion that, while not quite reaching the level of legal incompetence, nonetheless made it seem wise to have additional oversight over the Whitfield estate. Based on Thompson's assessment, Judge Parker extended the temporary injunction and appointed Charles Whitfield as co-administrator of his brother's estate. Eleanena was allowed to stay in the family home and would receive money for her living expenses, but all major financial decisions would now need Charles's approval, and this is where the story takes its most tragic turn. On the morning of July 17, 1843, a house servant discovered that Samuel was missing from his room. The entire property was searched, but there was no trace of him anywhere. Charles Whitfield immediately assumed Eleanena had arranged for Samuel to escape, probably with help from her lawyer Hayes, and he demanded the sheriff put together a search party to track him down and bring him back. Eleanena, however, insisted she had no idea where Samuel was. According to witness accounts, she was genuinely devastated by his disappearance. She even offered a large reward from her own personal money for any information that could lead to his safe return. The search party, made up of the sheriff, several deputies, and a professional slave catcher with tracking dogs, set out that afternoon to comb the surrounding countryside. They came back 3 days later with terrible news. Samuel's body had been found hanging from a cypress tree deep in the swampland about 2 miles from the Whitfield property. The official report said he had tried to escape, gotten lost and disoriented in the swamp, and realizing he was about to be caught, had taken his own life rather than face punishment. The authorities accepted this explanation without question, and Samuel was buried in an unmarked grave on the edge of the Whitfield property, as was the custom for enslaved people. Eleanena reportedly collapsed when she heard the news and had to be confined to her bed and sedated for several days. When she physically recovered, witnesses described her as completely changed, silent and withdrawn, where before she had been lively and spirited. She stopped fighting Charles's control of the estate and basically retreated into an increasingly isolated existence inside the Whitfield mansion. The official story of Samuel's death might have gone unchallenged forever, if not for an entry in Turner's journal dated August 3, 1843. Turner wrote that Mrs. Eleanena had spoken to her for the first time since the terrible news. She had said only, "They murdered him, Rebecca, they murdered him because he knew too much." When Turner asked what she meant, Eleanena went silent again and wouldn't say anything more. Turner wrote that she feared for Eleanena's mind and maybe for her safety too. That cryptic entry raises really disturbing questions about how Samuel actually died. If he was truly murdered rather than having taken his own life, who did it? The most obvious person with a reason to do it would be Charles Whitfield, who had the biggest motive to stop any disruption to the family's inheritance and social standing. But there's no direct evidence connecting him to Samuel's death, and the sheriff's report was signed and verified by multiple witnesses. What did Eleanena mean when she said Samuel knew too much? The most likely explanation connects back to their relationship and her secret pregnancy, but Turner's journal hints at another possibility too. In an entry from June 10, 1843, during the time when Dr. Thompson was evaluating Eleanena's mental state, Turner wrote that Samuel had confided in her that day. He believed Mr. Thomas had not died of natural causes. He had suspicions about the circumstances but wouldn't give details. He seemed scared and made Turner promise not to repeat his words to anyone, not even to Mrs. Eleanena. That single entry introduces the most jaw-dropping possibility of all, that Thomas Whitfield's death may not have been natural, as the official record claims. If Samuel believed Thomas had been murdered, and if he had shared those suspicions with anyone beyond Turner, it would give someone a very powerful reason to make sure he never spoke about it again. The historical record goes frustratingly quiet on this point. No autopsy was done on Thomas Whitfield's body, which was pretty normal for the time when the cause of death seemed obvious. Dr. Harris, who signed the death certificate, never mentioned anything suspicious in any of his surviving letters. If Thomas was indeed murdered, the truth died along with Samuel. After Samuel's death, Eleanena Whitfield settled into a pattern that would last for the next 15 years. She kept living in the family mansion, getting more and more cut off from Savannah society. Charles Whitfield managed the estate until he died in 1851, at which point control passed to Thomas's younger brother, Edward. Eleanena, even though she was technically entitled to take back control of her own inheritance as a widow, never made any move to do so. According to tax records and business ledgers, the Whitfield plantation kept doing well through the 1840s and early 1850s, but Eleanena seemed to have zero interest in how it was being run. Visitors to the estate during that time described her as ghost-like, pale and silent, drifting through the rooms of the big house as if she was looking for something she'd lost. She almost never left the property and had very few visitors. One of the only people who kept in regular contact with Eleanena during those years was her former lawyer, Martin Hayes. Even after being let go from his official position following the court's injunction, Hayes kept coming out to the Whitfield estate about once every 3 months, supposedly to drop off books and magazines from his frequent trips up north. These visits made Edward Whitfield suspicious enough that in 1854 he filed a complaint with the Chatham County Sheriff, suggesting Hayes might be using his access to the Whitfield property to do things that were against the public good, which was basically a not-so-subtle way of accusing him of abolitionist organizing. The sheriff investigated but found nothing to back up Edward's claims, and Hayes was allowed to keep visiting. What is certain is that during all those years, Eleanena kept a detailed private journal recording her thoughts and memories. That journal, if it still exists anywhere, has never been found. However, Hayes mentioned it in a letter to a colleague in Boston dated March 1856. He wrote that Mrs. W. was continuing to write down, all by herself, the tragic events that had shaped her life. He said she had told him these writings weren't meant for people of her own time, who wouldn't believe or understand her account, but for future generations. She had told him there would come a time when the truth could be spoken without fear, and that on that day she wanted her voice to be heard. If Eleanena had intended her journal to finally reveal the full truth about her relationship with Samuel, the circumstances of Thomas's death, and everything that followed, well, those hopes were crushed. On the night of November 12, 1858, a fire broke out in the east wing of the Whitfield mansion, where Eleanena's private rooms were located. By the time the plantation's enslaved workers could get organized to fight it, the flames had spread through most of the main house. Eleanena Whitfield's body was found in her bedroom. The coroner's report said she had died from smoke inhalation, apparently while she was asleep. She was 51 years old. Also lost in the fire were most of her personal belongings, almost certainly including her private journals and any other documents that might have finally shed light on the events of 1843. The timing of that fire raised questions that were never officially addressed. Just 2 weeks earlier, Edward Whitfield had died suddenly from what was called a bilious fever. Control of the estate had passed to his son, Thomas Whitfield II, who had just come back from college in Virginia with fresh ideas about modernizing the plantation's operations. According to plantation records, Thomas II had visited his Aunt Eleanena for the first time in several years on the very afternoon before the fire, but no one ever recorded what they talked about. Without Eleanena's own story to rely on, the true nature of her relationship with Samuel, the real circumstances of Thomas Whitfield's death, and what actually happened to Samuel remain wrapped in uncertainty. The official history, as written down in Chatham County records and family histories, barely mentions any of these events. The Whitfield family continued to be big players in Georgia society until the Civil War cut down their fortune, as it did for so many Southern plantation owners. The Whitfield plantation was sold in 1872 to Northern investors who turned it into a timber operation. The mansion, partially rebuilt after the 1858 fire, was used as housing for company managers until 1957, when yet another fire, blamed on faulty electrical wiring, destroyed what was left of the original structure. Today, the site is part of a private timber operation, closed to the public, with only the remnants of the original foundation stones barely poking out among the pine trees and undergrowth. Yet the story of Eleanena Whitfield, Thomas, and Samuel refuses to completely disappear. In 1964, a graduate student at Emory University named Elizabeth Montgomery started researching a thesis on women's legal status in antebellum Georgia. During her research, she came across references to the Whitfield case in the newly discovered court documents. Intrigued, she started piecing together the whole story, tracking down surviving letters, legal records, and even trying to find descendants of people connected to the case who might have kept family stories or documents alive. Montgomery's research brought her to Savannah in June 1968, where she arranged to examine the original court documents that had just been discovered during the courthouse renovations. Her investigation eventually uncovered something that had clearly been deliberately covered up, evidence that certain powerful descendants of the Whitfield family had been actively working for generations to make sure these events stayed buried. Montgomery's findings, published in a limited academic journal in 1971, were initially met with skepticism from the historical community. Several prominent Georgia historians disputed the authenticity of the recovered documents and questioned her methodology. However, a subsequent analysis of the documents by experts at the Library of Congress in 1974 confirmed that Turner's journal, Crawford's letters, and the other key documents were consistent in their paper, ink, and writing style with the claimed time period. The pushback against Montgomery's research wasn't limited to academic debates. Shortly after her article was published, she began receiving what she later described as pointed inquiries from legal representatives claiming to speak on behalf of unspecified clients with an interest in the historical record's accuracy. These contacts, which Montgomery described in a 1973 interview with the Atlanta Constitution as thinly veiled threats, suggested that some people with connections to the Whitfield family legacy were still very much alive and paying attention. Montgomery's suspicion that prominent Georgia families were working to suppress the historical record gained more weight in 1978, when a researcher at the Georgia Historical Society discovered that several documents related to the Whitfield case had been removed from the public archive sometime in the 1920s. The removal was documented in an internal memo that itself had been misfiled, apparently by accident among unrelated materials, the only reason it survived at all. The memo, signed by a senior archivist whose name had been partly obscured, referred to materials requiring restricted access at the request of interested parties. That's a very polite way of saying that someone with connections had asked for certain things to be hidden away from the public. The identity of those interested parties was never conclusively established, though Montgomery's research suggested links to a prominent Georgia political family whose ancestors had been business associates of Thomas Whitfield. That family, whose name Montgomery declined to publish out of what she described as an abundance of legal caution, had members who were still active in Georgia public life as recently as the 1970s, serving in local government, heading corporations, and sitting on the boards of influential cultural institutions. A definitive exposure of the family's historical secrets might still have real consequences today. What is certain is that the story of Eleanena Whitfield and Samuel represents a counter-narrative to the simplified version of history you often find in textbooks and on historical monuments. Their relationship, whatever it really was, challenges the idea that the lines between enslaved and enslaver, black and white, were always clearly drawn and never crossed. It reminds us that human connections form even in the most hostile environments, and that the heart often refuses to recognize the boundaries society creates. In the summer of 2007, a group of Emory University students doing an independent study project on historical research methods decided to visit the former Whitfield Plantation site. Unable to get official permission, they went onto the property after dark, hoping to document whatever physical evidence of the plantation's existence might still be around. According to an anonymous blog post that appeared briefly online before being taken down, the students found more than they expected. Deep on the property, far from the road and only reachable by a nearly invisible footpath, they found what appeared to be the remains of a small structure, a cabin or outbuilding that had been deliberately hidden by overgrown vegetation. Near that structure, partially buried in the ground, was a stone marker with the letter S roughly carved into it. The students thought this might have been a memorial to Samuel, placed there secretly by Eleanena or someone else who knew the real story of what had happened to him. Before they could fully document their find or do any digging, they were spotted by security personnel and escorted off the property. No charges were filed, but university officials apparently received a strongly worded letter from the property owner's legal representatives warning against any future trespassing. The student's discovery, if it's accurate, suggests that someone, maybe Eleanena herself, wanted to make sure Samuel wouldn't be completely forgotten, that some marker of his existence would remain on the land where he had lived and died. It's a deeply moving reminder that behind the dry legal documents and official histories are real human lives, real emotions, real love, real loss, real hope, and real despair that no court record or newspaper article can ever fully capture. Today, the story of Eleanena Whitfield and Samuel exists somewhere between documented history and legend. The official records tell one version of events: a wealthy plantation owner died of natural causes, his young widow acted erratically after his death, a valuable enslaved man tried to escape and died in the process, and the widow lived out the rest of her days alone until dying in a house fire. But the fragments that have emerged over the years, Turner's journal, Eleanena's diary, the hidden grave marker, hint at a completely different story. One of forbidden love, murder, conspiracy, and a truth so dangerous it has been actively suppressed for nearly 2 centuries. Maybe someday Eleanena's complete diary will turn up, or someone will be allowed to do a real archaeological investigation of the plantation site, or some descendant of the Whitfield family will come forward with documents that have been kept secret for generations. Until that happens, the full truth stays hidden, buried under layers of time, prejudice, and deliberate cover-up. Yet the story keeps going, whispered among historians, debated in academic journals, and shared now right here. It keeps going because it speaks to something fundamental about human experience, the tension between what society demands and what people personally desire, between the world as it is and the world as we wish it could be. Eleanena and Samuel, whatever the exact nature of what was between them, existed right at that painful intersection. Their story, with all its unanswered questions and murky details, doesn't offer easy moral lessons or comfortable endings. Instead, it reminds us of the messy, complicated reality of the past, and of all the countless human stories that history has still not fully told. Some locals say that on summer nights when the moon is high and the Spanish moss sways in the humid Georgia breeze, 2 figures can sometimes be glimpsed walking together on the old plantation grounds, a woman in 19th century dress and a tall man by her side. They appear briefly among the trees, people say, before vanishing back into the shadows. Scientists and skeptics say these sightings are just the product of imagination and local folklore, but the people who say they've seen those figures insist there's something more at work, as if the land itself remembers what happened there, as if some echo of Eleanena and Samuel still lingers, still searching for the justice and recognition that was denied to them in life. Whether you believe in that kind of thing or not, there is something compelling about the idea that their story refuses to be entirely forgotten, that it keeps coming back to the surface despite all the efforts to bury it. Maybe that persistence itself is a kind of justice, an acknowledgement that their lives mattered, that what happened to them matters, that the truth, however incomplete, deserves to be known. In the words Eleanena reportedly spoke to Martin Hayes before handing him her documents, there will come a time when the truth can be spoken without fear. More than 180 years later, we may still be waiting for that time to fully arrive, but in sharing what we know of their story, in piecing together the fragments that have survived years of intentional cover-up, we move one step closer to the reckoning with history that Eleanena envisioned. A reckoning not just with the specific events of her life, but with the bigger truths about humanity that her story reveals. The cemetery where Thomas Whitfield was laid to rest still exists. His family mausoleum still stands, worn down by time and neglect, but still there. Eleanena, according to property records, was buried in the family plot too, though her grave is unmarked. Of Samuel's final resting place, nothing certain is known beyond the student's disputed discovery of a stone marker deep in the woods. 3 lives connected by circumstance, by choice, and perhaps by love, now separated even in death. Thomas immortalized in stone, Eleanena present but unnamed, Samuel completely absent from official memory. Yet in another sense, they remain forever linked by the events of 1843, by the secrets they shared and the truths they kept hidden, and by the enduring power of their story to fascinate, disturb, and challenge us nearly 2 centuries later. In that persistence, in our continued desire to understand what happened at the Whitfield plantation, Eleanena, Thomas, and Samuel achieve a kind of immortality. Not the comfortable kind of remembrance that conventional history offers, but the more complicated, more human legacy of a story that refuses to fit neatly into the categories we try to put things in. The final word on the matter perhaps belongs to Eleanena herself, in what may be the most revealing passage from her recovered diary, dated January 1st, 1857. She wrote that people would never understand what existed between Samuel and herself. She said how could they? They saw only categories, master and slave, white and black, proper and forbidden. They couldn't imagine that two souls might recognize each other across such divides, that you could find in the most unlikely place the person who truly sees you. She wrote that for 15 years she had carried the weight of that truth alone. She had paid for it with her freedom, her reputation, her child, and the life of the man she loved. Yet even knowing what it had cost her, she would change nothing. To have known, even briefly, what it feels like to be fully seen and fully loved, that, she wrote, was worth any price. In a world determined to keep them separate, they had found each other. That was their victory, however short-lived, however tragic its end.